The human mind is a vast universe filled with unknown landscapes, hidden shadows, and forces that guide us without our awareness. We spend our lives searching for answers outside ourselves, waiting for someone else to tell us what to do, how to feel, how to heal. But what if the true answer lies within us? Sigmund Freud, the great explorer of the unconscious, left us a clear message. You cannot truly heal if you don't make yourself a priority. But what does this really mean? How can we apply it in our lives? From the moment we're born, we're taught to look outward. Society tells us we must be good children, good friends, good workers. We're educated to please others, to fit in, to not be selfish. But somewhere along the way, we forget something essential. You cannot give what you don't have. You cannot offer love if you don't love yourself. You cannot bring peace if there's chaos inside you. You cannot accompany others if you don't even know who you are. Freud dedicated his life to exploring the human psyche and discovered that within each person exist hidden forces, unconscious drives that govern our thoughts and emotions. One of the most important concepts he developed was that of repression, that part of ourselves we suppress, deny, and hide from the world. Why do we do this? Because we were taught that certain emotions are unacceptable, that anger is bad, that pain is weakness, that sadness is something to flee from. But Freud warns us, what you repress controls you, what you acknowledge transforms you. So when we talk about prioritizing ourselves to heal, we're not talking about simple acts of superficial self-care. It's not just about taking a day off, exercising, or eating healthy. We're talking about something much deeper, a radical commitment to our own truth without fear, without masks, without seeking validation from others. It's confronting what has been repressed, looking at what hurts, what makes us uncomfortable, what frightens us. And here comes the great paradox. When you dare to look at yourself without filters, without judgments, without escaping, that's when you begin to heal. But it's not easy. We live in a world that constantly distracts us, bombards us with information, expectations, comparisons. We disconnect from ourselves to fit in, to be accepted. And when we finally try to reconnect, we find a terrifying silence, a void we prefer to avoid. But that void is not your enemy. That void is the space where your true self begins. Prioritizing yourself to heal doesn't mean ignoring others or becoming insensitive or indifferent. It means you stop expecting the world to save you and take responsibility for your own healing. It means listening to yourself, giving yourself permission to feel without guilt, establishing boundaries without fear, daring to be who you really are without apologizing. Freud described the process of coming to terms with one's unconscious drives as not an easy or quick journey. It's a process that involves pain, doubts, crises. But it's also the path that leads to fulfillment, because when you allow yourself to be who you are without denying any part of yourself, without hiding your repressed desires, without fleeing from your instincts, you discover something incredible. True healing isn't about eliminating your pain but integrating it. And in that integration, in that act of embracing yourself completely, you find something more valuable than any external validation, the freedom to be authentic. In the depths of our psyche, beyond reason and logic, dwells a hidden world full of symbols, patterns, and invisible forces that shape our lives without our even noticing. Freud understood that to truly heal, it's not enough to change habits or adopt positive thoughts. It's about a journey to the very core of our existence, where we face the lost fragments of our identity. This journey is not just a philosophical or intellectual exploration, but a deeply emotional and visceral process. It forces us to look at wounds we've carried since childhood, those that were buried under layers of social conditioning, unresolved traumas, and others' expectations. It forces us to confront the voices in our minds that tell us we're not enough, that we don't deserve love, that we'll never truly be free. And here is where the concept of the unconscious mind comes in, one of Freud's most important contributions to psychology. The unconscious is where our repressed desires, memories, and instincts reside. These repressed elements influence our behavior and emotions in ways we often don't recognize. They appear in our dreams, in our slips of the tongue, in our seemingly inexplicable behaviors. One of the core insights of Freudian theory is that our adult personalities and behaviors are profoundly shaped by our earliest experiences. The relationships we form with our primary caregivers create templates that influence how we relate to others for the rest of our lives. But for healing to begin, we must first descend into darkness, face our deepest fears, our own repressed desires. In simpler terms, this means that to heal, we cannot avoid pain. We cannot run from what torments us. We must go through it, feel it, understand it, and only then can we transcend it. The problem is that most people fear this process. They prefer the comfort of the familiar, even if that means living in suffering, in constant dissatisfaction. They cling to toxic relationships, to jobs that destroy them, to habits that consume them, simply because change seems terrifying. Freud said that what we do not bring to consciousness appears in our lives as fate. This means that if we don't face our internal conflicts, they will find ways to manifest in our external reality, whether in patterns of destructive relationships, illnesses, existential crises, or a permanent feeling of emptiness. This is where personal prioritization becomes fundamental, not as a selfish act but as an unwavering commitment to our own growth. True healing begins when we stop blaming the world for our suffering and start looking within ourselves with courage. What patterns are we repeating? What wounds are we ignoring? What emotions are we suppressing? Healing is not a linear process. There will be moments when we feel we've advanced and others when it seems we've regressed. But Freud taught us that everything has a purpose in our development. Even crises, even suffering, especially suffering, because in it we find the keys to our transformation. Many people seek answers externally, in books, in teachers, in religions, in ideologies. And although all this can offer guidance and support, the only truth that really frees us is the one we discover within ourselves. Freud called this process of uncovering the unconscious analysis, the search for our most deeply buried truths. And this process is only possible when we give ourselves permission to be who we really are, without fear, without shame, without the need to fit into molds imposed by others. But this comes at a cost. Not everyone will understand your path. When you begin to prioritize yourself, when you stop acting according to others' expectations and start listening to your inner voice, some people may drift away. You may face rejection, incomprehension, loneliness. But that's the price of authenticity. And what you gain in exchange is infinitely more valuable. A deep connection with yourself, a life lived from truth, a freedom that cannot be taken away by anyone. The unconscious is an ocean full of mysteries, hidden messages, fragments of our essence waiting to be discovered. Freud left us a map, but the journey is personal, and the only way to travel it is by making the decision to prioritize ourselves, to look within, to face with honesty and without fear the emotions we carry inside. The emotions we carry within us are like echoes of past experiences. Some clear, others so buried in our memory that we don't even know they exist. They affect our way of thinking, our relationships, how we perceive the world. Freud understood that forces operate within us beyond our consciousness. Energies that shape our destiny even when we believe we're in control. One of the most fascinating concepts in his work is that of the ID, ego, and superego, the three components of our psyche that interact and sometimes conflict with each other. The ID represents our primitive instincts and desires, operating according to the pleasure principle and seeking immediate gratification. The superego embodies our internalized moral standards and ideals, the should and should not we've absorbed from society. The ego mediates between these two forces, trying to satisfy the ID's demands while considering the constraints of reality and the superego's moral judgments. Freud discovered that when these forces are out of balance, we experience internal conflicts that reflect in our external reality. For example, a person with excessive superego control may feel disconnected from their desires, unable to express vulnerability, trapped in extreme rationality that isolates them from others. On the other hand, someone dominated by the ID may be impulsive, struggling with boundaries, caught in a constant battle between what they feel and what society says they should do. Emotional healing involves finding a healthy balance among these forces, between instinct and morality, between desire and reality. This process doesn't happen overnight. Freud spoke about the importance of dreams and free association in our internal transformation. Dreams are not just random night images but reflections of our unconscious wishes and conflicts. Each of us lives our own personal neurosis, an unconscious narrative that guides our decisions and expectations. Some live the story of the savior, feeling their purpose in life is to rescue others, even at their own expense. Others are trapped in the complex of martyrdom, believing they must suffer to deserve love or recognition. And many are immersed in the narrative of the victim, convinced that external circumstances are a cage from which they can never escape. But here's the key point. When we become aware of the story we're living, we can rewrite it. We can choose to stop being victims of fate and become creators of our own lives. Freud believed that the unconscious is not only formed by wounds and traumas, but also by infinite potential, by a creative power waiting to be awakened. The problem is that this potential is often blocked by thought patterns we've absorbed since childhood. Ideas like, "I'm not good enough," "love always hurts." Life is a constant struggle install in our minds and become self-fulfilling prophecies. We define ourselves through limiting beliefs without realizing we have the power to question and change them. But to do so, we must first recognize them. This brings us to another essential point: the importance of introspection. We live in a world where distraction is the norm, where there's always something to occupy our minds so we don't have to face ourselves. Social networks, work, constant entertainment, all designed to keep us focused externally and away from our interior. But true healing only occurs in stillness, in those moments when we dare to be alone with our thoughts, without filters, without excuses. Freud used the technique of free association to communicate with his patient's unconscious. Instead of ignoring the thoughts and emotions that emerged, he explored them consciously, allowing them to manifest as images, voices, sensations. He didn't repress or judge them. He observed them, listened to them, dialogued with them. He discovered that within each emotion, even the most painful one, there's a message, a truth waiting to be understood. When we prioritize ourselves, when we give ourselves the space to explore our internal world, we begin to realize how much of our life has been controlled by invisible forces. We realize that many of our choices haven't really been ours, but rather the result of others' expectations, inherited fears, mental programs we've accepted without questioning. The question is, what happens when we finally take control? When we decide that our life will not be defined by the past, by pain, by what others expect from us. Change isn't immediate, but it's inevitable. When a person begins to act from their authenticity, when they stop betraying themselves to please others, everything around them begins to transform. Some relationships disappear because they no longer resonate with the new version of oneself. Others strengthen because they're now based on truth rather than need. Opportunities that once seemed impossible begin to manifest because we've stopped self-sabotaging. But all this is only possible if we have the courage to prioritize ourselves, to make our healing a real priority and not just an abstract idea. Because in the end, no one will come to rescue us. There are no saviors, no external answers that can fill the internal void. The only person who can do this work is yourself. The idea of prioritizing yourself for emotional healing may seem simple in theory, but in practice, it's an act of profound courage. It's not just a matter of superficial self-care, taking a break, or giving yourself small pleasures. It's a radical commitment to personal truth, to authenticity, to recognizing what we really need to evolve. Freud understood that emotional healing is not a linear process but a series of internal deaths and rebirths, a spiral journey to the deepest corners of the soul. One of the biggest obstacles in this process is fear. Fear of the unknown, fear of change, fear of what we'll find when we stop distracting ourselves with the noise of the outside world. We've been taught to fear our own repressed desires, to see them as something that must be eradicated rather than understood. But Freud made it clear that ignoring these repressed elements doesn't make them disappear. On the contrary, repression transforms them into an autonomous force that influences our life from the shadows, guiding our actions without our realizing it. Repression is not just about the dark side of our personality, but also the home of everything we've suppressed. All the parts of ourselves we've denied to fit in, to be accepted, to avoid pain. There lie our hidden desires, our unexpressed anger, our forbidden passions, our talents we never allowed ourselves to develop. And the only way to integrate these parts is not by rejecting them, but by dialoguing with them, understanding them, giving them a place in our psyche. This is where the notion of the integrated self comes into play. This self is not just the ego. It's not the image we project to the world, nor the set of roles we play in society. It's something much deeper, the totality of our psychic existence, the union of consciousness and the unconscious, the point at which we achieve an internal harmony where we're no longer divided into fragments, masks, contradictions that tear us apart inside. To reach this point, it's necessary to go through a phase that Freud described as confronting the repressed. This is an uncomfortable process because it forces us to see things we'd prefer to ignore. It shows us our weaknesses, our deepest fears, our insecurities, but it also reveals our true potential, what we could be if we dared to embrace our totality. However, most people avoid this confrontation. They prefer to stay in a comfort zone, even if that zone is full of suffering, because at least it's familiar. They prefer to cling to an identity that feels comfortable, even if that identity is a cage. They identify with their wounds, with their traumas, with their limitations, and in that attachment to the old, they deny themselves the possibility of transformation. Freud understood that true healing doesn't occur when we eliminate suffering from our lives, but when we understand it, when we convert it into wisdom, when we use it as fuel for our evolution. It's not about denying pain, but learning to listen to it, to see what message it brings us, what part of ourselves is asking for attention. At this point, an essential question arises. How do we start this process? How do we stop being prisoners of our wounds and start truly prioritizing ourselves? The answer isn't simple or universal because each person has a different path, but there's something that's true for everyone. The first step is always awareness. We cannot change what we don't recognize. We cannot heal what we refuse to see. Healing begins with honesty, with the courage to look at ourselves in the mirror without filters, without excuses, without masks. This involves questioning our most deeply rooted beliefs, challenging the stories we've told ourselves about who we are and what's possible for us. It involves stopping the external search and beginning to listen to our own inner voice. It involves stopping betraying ourselves to please others, stopping postponing our happiness out of fear of what others will say. When we prioritize ourselves, we start noticing things that previously went unnoticed. We begin to realize how we talk to ourselves, how we treat ourselves, how much we allow ourselves to feel, express, create. We begin to see that many of our emotions aren't ours but the result of external conditioning, inherited wounds, unconscious patterns that have been in our family for generations. And here comes another of Freud's great revelations: the power of early childhood experiences. We aren't just isolated individuals but parts of a larger whole. Our emotions, our fears, our beliefs are connected to something much broader than our personal experience. Many of our wounds don't come just from our individual history, but from the history of our family, our culture, our society. Healing, then, is not just an individual act, but an act of collective transformation. When a person dares to break a pattern, to question a belief, to free themselves from a trauma, they're generating a change that transcends their own life. They're opening a path for others to do the same. They're demonstrating with their own existence that there's another way to live, to feel, to be. This is the power of prioritizing yourself. It's not selfishness. It's not indifference toward others. It's quite the opposite. It's the most generous act we can do, because only when we're in balance can we truly contribute something to the world. Only when we heal ourselves can we stop projecting our pain onto others, stop repeating stories of suffering, stop perpetuating destructive dynamics. And yet, the fear persists, fear of letting go of the old, fear of what will happen when we dare to live from our truth. But Freud made it clear that fear is not a sign that we should stop. It's a sign that we're on the threshold of change. It's proof that we're leaving the mental prison in which we've lived and entering unknown territory where everything is possible. Are we willing to take the next step? To look within ourselves without fear, without judgment, without excuses? Because in the end, healing isn't something that happens at a specific moment in a specific place. It's a continuous journey, a process in which every day we choose to be a little more ourselves, a little freer, a little more conscious. And it all begins when we decide once and for all that our life belongs to us. The process of emotional healing and self-knowledge also involves a key question. What parts of ourselves have we left behind on life's journey? Freud talked about the process of facing our repressed desires, a journey in which we gradually shed the layers of conditioning imposed on us to finally discover who we essentially are. It's a complex process because from a young age, we learn to adapt to what's expected of us, to mold ourselves according to the standards of our family, our culture, our society. And in that adaptation, we inevitably sacrifice aspects of our being. Sometimes what we lose is our ability to play, to experience life with curiosity and without fear of error. Other times, we leave behind our true dreams, compromising them in exchange for being accepted. But what we ignore is that these parts of us don't disappear. They remain trapped in the unconscious, waiting to be recognized, waiting to be integrated again. That's why many people experience a feeling of emptiness, of dissatisfaction, even when externally they seem to have everything. They may have achieved professional success, personal stability, social recognition, and yet they feel something is missing. That something is nothing other than their own essence, that part of themselves that was relegated at some point along the way and now clamors to be heard. Emotional healing, then, is not just a process of freeing oneself from past pain but also an act of recovery. It's reconnecting with what makes us feel alive, with what gives us meaning. It's remembering what passionate us before we were told what was correct, what fulfilled us before age and logic took control. It's rescuing the parts of ourselves that were forgotten in the process of becoming what we believed we should be. But this rescue doesn't happen by itself. It requires internal work, an honest exploration of our emotions, our desires, our wounds. It requires courage to face the discomfort of discovering that, in many cases, we've been our own jailers, that we've told ourselves stories to justify why we're not happy, why we don't change, why we keep repeating the same patterns. Freud was clear that the unconscious is not an enemy. It's an ally, but only when we learn to listen to it. And to do so, we must learn to read its signs. The unconscious communicates in many ways, in our dreams, in our automatic reactions, in the patterns that repeat over and over in our lives. If we always end up in relationships that hurt us, if we always fall into the same conflicts, if we feel trapped in an endless cycle, it's not a coincidence. These are messages from within, warnings that there's something we haven't seen, something that needs attention. However, instead of listening to these messages, we often choose distraction. We immerse ourselves in work, in entertainment, in the constant noise of modern life because stopping to feel can be terrifying. But the problem is that what we ignore doesn't disappear. It accumulates, intensifies, until at some point it forces us to pay attention. It can manifest as anxiety, depression, a feeling of chronic dissatisfaction we can't explain. It can appear as a crisis, as a feeling of being lost without knowing why. And it's in those moments when we have two options: continue ignoring what we feel or finally face it. Prioritizing yourself to heal means choosing the second option. It means allowing ourselves to feel without fear, without judging ourselves, without minimizing our experience. It means giving ourselves permission to ask what we really want, what makes us happy, what hurts us, what motivates us. It means stopping the search for answers outside and starting to look inside. This process of introspection isn't easy, but it's deeply transformative. As we get to know ourselves better, we begin to realize how many of our decisions have been driven by fear rather than genuine desire. We realize how many times we've acted against ourselves simply to avoid the discomfort of disappointing others. We realize that the life we've built perhaps doesn't really reflect who we are but who we've believed we should be. And here arises another essential point: the importance of responsibility. Healing emotionally doesn't mean blaming others for our wounds, but taking responsibility for what we do with them. We can't change what happened to us in the past, but we can decide what to do with it. We can continue carrying pain as an excuse, or we can use it as a motor to grow, to transform ourselves, to create something new from it. Freud spoke about the possibility of making the unconscious conscious, the process by which human beings transform their wounds into wisdom, their darkness into light, their suffering into self-knowledge. True healing doesn't consist of eliminating what hurts us but giving it new meaning, understanding that each experience, no matter how difficult it may have been, has taught us something, has shaped us in some way. Instead of remaining trapped in the question of why this happened to me, we can ask ourselves what I can learn from this. When we adopt this perspective, our relationship with the past changes. We stop seeing ourselves as victims of what happened to us and begin to see ourselves as the creators of our own destiny. We realize that we're not defined by our wounds but by what we choose to do with them. And at that moment, we regain our power. But this isn't a process done once and for all. It's a continuous journey, a daily work of self-awareness, self-observation, making decisions aligned with our truth. There will be moments when we doubt, when we want to return to the familiar, when fear will try to convince us it's safer to stay where we are. But each time we choose to prioritize ourselves, each time we choose to listen to ourselves and act from our authenticity, we're strengthening our connection with our true being. And that's the key. Healing isn't a destination but a path. A path in which, step by step, we recover the parts of ourselves we left behind, we integrate what we previously rejected, and we live not from lack but from wholeness. As we advance on this path of emotional healing, we realize something fundamental. Prioritizing ourselves isn't an act of selfishness but of responsibility. We live in a society that has taught us to put others' needs before our own, to measure our worth based on how much we give, how much we sacrifice, how hard we try to please others. But this mentality only distances us from ourselves. Freud reminded us that true transformation begins when we dare to look at ourselves with honesty, when we stop seeking external validation and commit to our own well-being. Healing isn't a linear process. There are moments of clarity and others of confusion, moments of advance and others when we feel we're regressing. But what's important isn't perfection but consistency. Each small decision we make in favor of our well-being is an act of self-love. Each time we choose ourselves, we're reaffirming our right to be authentic, to be free, to be fulfilled. Throughout this process, we'll learn to establish boundaries without guilt, to say no when necessary, to move away from what hurts us without feeling responsible for others' discomfort. We'll learn to listen to ourselves, to trust our intuition, to stop searching for answers outside because we'll know that everything we need is within us. Emotional healing isn't something we do for a time and then finish. It's a way of life, a commitment to our own evolution. And the most beautiful thing of all is that when we heal ourselves, we also heal the world around us. We become living examples of what it means to live from authenticity, from self-love, from consciousness. And in doing so, we inspire others to do the same. Because in the end, the greatest revolution is the one that occurs within us. The decision to prioritize ourselves, to listen to ourselves, to give ourselves the space to heal is the first step toward a freer, more authentic, more fulfilled life. And that's the true essence of the journey into our unconscious. Not just understanding it, but transforming it into a source of power, growth, and truth.